Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about controversy and comic books. Now, controversy and popular culture kind of go hand in hand. In each one of our units so far, we've talked about criticism that was leveled against the thing we were talking about. So, silent movies, there were critics. Swing music, there were critics. Comic books, there were critics. But as we get to the late 40s and into the middle 1950s, comic books generated a degree of controversy that was almost unprecedented. And the response to this controversy by the industry, the creation of the Comics Magazine Association of America, and the comic book code, were really going to transform the nature of the comic book industry. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, to understand some of this controversy, it'd be helpful to talk about a really important comic book publisher, EC Comics. EC was never the largest comic book publisher, but it had a very loyal and devoted following because of the quality of the comic books combined with some of the risky content of these comic books. EC was quite different from a number of comic book publishers in the 40s and 1950s. EC Comics was started by a man named Max Gaines. And originally the idea of EC Comics was as educational comics. In fact, initially the EC stood for Educational Comics, to try and take subject matters that parents would want their kids to learn about, that teachers would want children to learn about, and put them into comic book form. All right, that was the idea of this. Help kids learn about the Bible or the American Revolution, put those stories into comic book versions. That was the original idea behind EC Comics. Max Gaines, however, unfortunately died in an accident in 1947, and his son William took over. And William took the company in a very different direction, moving away from children's educational comics and more towards horror comics, science fiction comics, particularly mature science fiction comics, and true crime comic books. Basically, William took the company in a 180-degree turn in terms of the content of their comics. The content of these comics could be quite shocking. In fact, to this day, some of the things in EC Comics are shocking. There are very few things from other areas of 1950s popular culture that are very shocking to us today. In the 1950s, around the same time that we're talking about, the middle 1950s, Elvis Presley was shocking to the American public. Today, oh my goodness, Elvis seems downright wholesome. Movies that seemed very controversial in the 1950s, shocking. Today, oh man, that seems like nothing. But there are things, particularly in EC's true crime comics, that would still be shocking today. All right? And so, again, EC was never as big a publisher as Fawcett or Marvel or DC, but it had a very niche and loyal following. Now, one of the things that differentiated EC was also EC dealt with social issues, political issues, and often dealt with them in very progressive ways for the time. In a previous lecture, I talked about the idea of the late 40s into the early 1960s as this age of consensus, this period in which um, there was less engagement with controversial social and political issues, that there seemed to be a lot of consensus when it came to things like ideas about foreign policy. There was a lot of ignoring of social issues from the late 40s into the early 1960s. As we'll talk about in a later lecture, by the time we start getting to the mid-1950s, this is going to explode and social issues are going to become massive again in American culture. But particularly in the 1950s, social issues were not being dealt with in a lot of areas of American cultural life, at least popular cultural life. EC, however, was different in dealing front on with a lot of controversial social and political issues. This cell right here is from a comic called Judgment Day, an EC science fiction storyline. In your book, Brad Wright gives the entire final page of this one, but this is the final cell in it. The story Judgment Day was the story of kind of almost like a Star Trek sort of storyline, where there's a galactic federation that goes around the universe looking to admit members and to help solve problems. And there was a planet of robots, and these robots were identical, except for their outward color. There were blue robots and there were orange robots, and underneath they were exactly the same, but on the outside they were different. One, blue, orange. As time went on, the Robot Society had developed a two-tiered system where one of the colors was able to rule and was treated better, and the other was segregated and discriminated against. And so the Federation sends an astronaut to this planet to try and resolve their issues, and if their issues could be resolved, to allow this robot planet to become part of the Federation. The astronaut throughout the entire comic keeps his helmet on because he can't breathe the atmosphere. He tries to resolve the issues, tries to explain to the dominant robots that the other robots are exactly like you, it's just a different color. On the outside, there's no reason to discriminate against these robots, you are the same. But alas, the astronaut just couldn't solve the problem. And so he returns back to his spaceship, and in this last cell that we see here, he takes off his helmet, and we see that the astronaut was African American. If the analogy to American race relations with robots that were exactly the same, just a different color on the outside, wasn't perfectly apparent at this point, when we see the astronaut and the astronaut is African American, then it becomes clear what that comic is really about. That comic is really about American race relations. And EC was one of the few comic book publishers that was dealing with issues like this. Not only dealing with it, but dealing with it in such a progressive way. I mean, look at this man. This was still a time in the 1950s where caricatures and images of African Americans could be depicted in very offensive ways. Big bug eyes, big thick lips. Even relatively sympathetic treatments of African Americans. Black Americans could be depicted in ways that look offensive. But not this guy. I mean, look at him. He's beautiful. Look at his noble posture. Look at his eyes gazing up towards the sky. His his sweat is diamonds. I mean, it's such a beautiful depiction of a human being, such a noble depiction of a human being. And that was the entire purpose of the story, right? And so EC was so different from so many other comic book publishers at the time of dealing with social and political issues. There was another EC storyline about a white soldier who fought in Korea. By the time we get to the Korean War, the American military had been integrated. So in Korea, white and black soldiers fought together. And this white soldier in Korea, he had had his life saved by an African-American soldier. And an African-American soldier did something to save this white soldier, and the African-American soldier died because of it. Well, the African-American soldier didn't have family, and so the white soldier sent word back to his family that he wanted this soldier buried with the family plot. This man saved my life. He has nobody else. He needs to be shown respect. He saved my life. Bury him in the family plot. A white soldier returns back to the war, finds out that the family did not bury him. The black soldier was buried in the segregated black cemetery and not with the family plot. And he goes on to give a speech about the unjust nature of this man who fought to defend America, to defend American freedom and American equality, and yet this is how he was treated after giving the ultimate sacrifice for America. Even in death, he was discriminated against. EC regularly dealt with controversial social topics at a time in American history, the late 40s and 1950s, where you just didn't see this get dealt with as much. I mean, just other comic books tended to be just lily white. You just didn't see black characters. You didn't see black superheroes. You didn't even see black people in the background, waiting for the bus as Superman was flying by. And EC was dealing with this subject matter full on. But they dealt with some shocking stuff. Their true crime stories could be shocking. This is one of their most famous covers. Then we have this man after killing this woman and her severed head. EC. Don't make the mistake I did in your writing or on your exams. They're only one letter apart. DC, Detective Comics, and EC. Eventually, EC would switch from educational comics and it would become known as entertainment comics. One of the things that EC was known for was not only their mature subject matter, not only their more their willingness to deal with social issues, but the quality of the artwork. Take a look, and this is again, this one's reprinted in your book. Take a look at Brad Wright's reprint. It shows up, the resolution's better than what you're seeing here. The quality of the art was so much better. Just look at these reports. This was a storyline about nuclear war, and it was a comic against nuclear proliferation. These are reporters calling into the newspaper to let them know nuclear war is going to start at the 10th at noon. And just the expressions in the detail in their faces is rather amazing. Well, because of the controversial nature of some of these comic books, particularly EC, but there were other comic book publishers pushing boundaries. There was growing criticism that was leveled against comic books in the late 40s into the 1950s. Cities and counties were starting to create laws trying to prohibit the sale and limit the sale of comic books. Los Angeles in the late 1940s created the Board of Supervisors, created one of the most stringent anti-comic book laws. It was eventually found unconstitutional, but it initially it became a model that was copied by cities around the United States. More laws were being created to try and curb the influence of comic books. Now, one person in particular was very responsible for this. A man by the name of Frederick Wertham. Frederick Wertham was a psychiatrist who had done many sort of noble and good things in his career. He was a true believer in the importance of mental health services. Back in the when he started his work into the 1920s, mental health services were only for the wealthy, the upper middle class. The poor, the working class, had very little access to adequate mental health services, and Wertham was a big advocate of mental health for the poor, for the working, for everybody. That mental health services should be for anybody who is in need. He was a strong advocate for mental health services for African Americans who were often denied access to mental health services. He helped create a clinic he initially tried to do it through the city in New York City, but after it being rejected, helped create a clinic in Harlem that would offer African Americans or mental health services for African Americans. Wertham did a lot of good things. But by the time we start getting to the mid-40s and accelerating after that, Wertham's interest started to turn towards juvenile mental health, and particularly comic books. Wertham was a behavioralist and believed that environment was very important. And he came to strongly believe that comic books were having a negative impact on American children. That the violence, the sexuality, the deviancy in comic books was warping the minds of children. Excuse me. Now, this was also dovetailing with a growing fear of juvenile delinquency in the late 40s into the 1950s. There was this belief that there was a growing juvenile delinquency crisis in America in the post-war period. Now, this was not backed up by statistics. There actually was no increase in juvenile crime in the late 40s into the 1950s. But there are always anecdotal examples of young people doing horrible things. There have always been bad kids who do bad things. And the human mind is really geared toward learning from single examples of things. We should pay more attention to statistics and trends. But our mind doesn't seem to want to work that way. We are attracted to narrative examples, single examples. I could tell you all about the statistics of juvenile delinquency and the numbers aren't increasing. And then somebody could tell you about a child who started torturing dogs and then goes on to torture a neighbor kid. And the thing that's going to really resonate with you is that kid that tortured dogs. And then people are going to say, what's wrong with kids today? Kids in my days didn't do those things. They actually did back in your day. But you just heard this recent example, recency bias. And that's what's sticking in your brain. And so it doesn't matter that there was no distinguishable increase in juvenile crime in the late 40s and 1950s. The importance was that there was a growing belief this was happening. By the way, some of this was dovetailed with women working during World War II. Some people who saw women working during World War II and didn't like it, even though it was an emergency and it was deemed necessary by many Americans, there were some Americans who said, no, this is going to lead to bad repercussions. All these women working, all these women being outside of the home, you wait until the kids of this generation start growing up and getting older. There's going to be a generation of juvenile delinquents that are going to grow up here. And so by the time we get to the mid-1950s, these are those children. And some people had created a self-fulfilling prophecy where they predicted that this was going to happen. But there was no actual increase. Well, Wortham's research, and I'll talk about the sketchy nature of Wortham's research in a little while, was giving a simple explanation for what was causing this supposed increase in juvenile delinquency. Comic books. People love simple explanation. Usually for large, broad-based societal problems, there are a variety of issues involved and they tend to be very complex and difficult to deal with. That's the reality. But people are continually drawn to simple, singular explanations that can improve situations. So here comes Wortham, who starts publishing articles in the late 40s, and I'll talk about his book in a minute. Publishes an important book in the mid-50s, saying the rise in juvenile delinquency is largely attributable to kids' minds getting warped from comic books. That's a simple explanation. That's an easy explanation. Doesn't require parents to do much, doesn't require schools to be better, doesn't require better mental health services to kids. Nope. All we got to do is get rid of comic books and the problem will be solved. People are attracted to simple explanations with simple solutions. Well, in 1954, Wortham published a book called The Seduction of the Innocent, all about how comic books and the comic book publishing industry for profit was warping children's minds with comic books. Superheroes with unrealistic power, women in scantily clad attire, sexual deviancy on within many comic books represented. This was Wortham's argument that the comic book industry was warping the minds of kids. And he had all kinds of research and statistics to try and back most of this up. However, a lot of his research didn't hold up very well. And the biggest problem with Wortham's conclusions had to do with the issue of causality. How do you prove a comic book caused a child to behave in a certain way? It's often more complicated than people might imagine. By the way, this is also the problem in general of trying to attribute negative effects to popular culture more broadly. How do you prove a cause? So take, for example, a kid who read a Superman comic, decides he wants to be like Superman, gets a bath towel out of the pantry, out of the closet, ties it around his neck like he's Superman, gets the ladder, climbs up onto the roof of the garage, and tries to fly like Superman, falls down and breaks his neck. See? That's because of Superman. That's because of comic books. We got to do something about comic books. That sounds really convincing when you first hear it. Yeah, that's bad. But how do you prove the causality? Literally millions of other kids read that Superman comic book also. Millions. They didn't try to fly. They didn't jump off a roof. Maybe there were other issues going on with that kid. Maybe that child has a bad home life. Maybe he's in an abusive environment. And the reason he was so attracted to Superman's ability to fly was that he wanted to fly away from his bad home life. Okay? Maybe he was showing early onset signs of mental illness. How do you prove comic books caused these things? You look more into the contemporary, we hear these arguments against violent video games all the time. Violent video games are bad. Something should be done to outlaw and ban these violent video games. One of the ironies of this argument is the decline in violent crime in America lines up almost exactly with the introduction of violent video games. The statistical reality is that there has been no increase in violent crime in America. In fact, just the opposite. In fact, some have argued that violent video games have offered an outlet for people that otherwise might have engaged in violent activity. I think that's going a bit too far myself. But think of it this way. Every second somebody is sitting in their house playing a violent video game is a second they are not out in the street actually committing a crime. Okay? There just is no correlation to violent crime and a video game like the Call of Duty franchise. There might be somebody who commits a crime that played Call of Duty, and you will sometimes hear about this. Hey, this guy killed 3 people. Guess what? He loved to play Call of Duty. Yes. And so do tens of millions of other people around the globe. They also do it. And the vast, vast majority of them do not engage in actual violence. So how can you try to prove causality, that video game caused that, where the actual percentage connection is so slight and infinitesimal? All right, you have the same issue. And so what Wortham had in his book were lots of really compelling anecdotal examples. Some kids doing some horrible things. And these kids just so happened to read comic books. But he had no way to demonstrate a kind of causal connection. But again, our brain seems to be wired to be attracted to story, to anecdotal examples. Statistics just don't capture us in the same way. And even some of the statistics that he gave were either misrepresented or needed greater context to make sense. For example, one of the often cited statistics is 90% of boys in reformatories, juvenile halls, kid prisons, read comic books. 90% of them. It's like, whoa, once again, whoa, that's a big number. Now, hey, Hey, you want causality? Hey, 90%. Wow. Yeah, but there's a broader context to that number. 90% of boys outside of reform school were also reading comic books at that time. 90% of the kids on the football team were reading comic books. That doesn't mean comic books made you good at football. 90% of the boys and girls on the chess team, well, at least the boys. That number was lower for girls. So let me stick with boys. 90% of the boys on the chess team read comic books. That doesn't mean comic books made you a good chess player, all right? And so Wortham wasn't contextualizing his numbers. Later researchers really shredded the book. But what mattered is this generated a lot of interest in comic books. So much so that same year, the United States Senate held a hearing to investigate juvenile delinquency with particular focus on comic books. This is a still picture from the hearing, and they had created an example of some of these controversial comic books. Most of these, by the way, not all of them, but many of them were EC comics. William Gaines was one of the people that was brought before the committee, and William Gaines did his best to defend free speech and the right of comic book publishers. But the hearing did not go well. And often the United States Senate will hold these kinds of hearings as a way to try to pressure industries to reform themselves with the threat of further government intervention, sort of to warn business leaders, if you don't do something about this business leader, we, the United States Senate, will start doing something for you. And so this Senate hearing in 1954 really scared a number of comic book publishers. The big comic book publishers feared if they didn't do something to try and regulate themselves, that the government was going to start to intervene in their business. And so a number of the large comic book publishers pulled together and created an organization called the Comics Magazine Association of America. And this was going to be a sort of review board. The movie industry had already done something similar to this. And so the comic book publishers were copying broadly this model, where the Comics Magazine Association of America would review comic books. They would be submitted to the committee. By the way, the committee, the people actually reviewing these comic books were mostly made up of women. It was believed that women have a more finely tuned sense of propriety, that you really couldn't trust men to do this. We got to get women to do it because they're a better judge of these kinds of things. More moral, more religious. They will do a better job of this. They would review these comics. And if everything was fine for the comic would get the seal of approval. This is a copy of the stamp that you would get, the Comic Code Authority. Here's a cover, and you could see it's a Batman comic that had received one of these. If there were issues with the comic book, the publisher would be informed. This thing on page such and such is inappropriate. You need to change this. You need to do something about it. The publisher could change it, resubmit it. If it was deemed acceptable, now it would get the stamp, and it could be printed with this stamp on it. This was going to be a way to inform parents that their comic books were acceptable and had been reviewed. Now, really important, this was a voluntary organization. No publisher was required to submit their comic books. Okay? It was the same with movies back in the day. Later on in the 1980s, the record industry, just like the comic book industry in the 1950s, after Senate hearings that had created a lot of negative publicity and in fear of being regulated by the government, the recording industry started to put parental advisory stickers on albums and cassette tapes in those days, later CDs. Same thing. This model had been done in various industries. But it was voluntary. Nobody had to submit their comics to the Comics Magazine Association, to the Comic Code Authority. But here's the thing, and this is why this criticism and this controversy was different than most examples in the history of American popular culture. Throughout most of American popular culture, pop culture generates criticism and people complain. And yet, the content pretty much doesn't change. Again, think of violent video games and think of how much people complain about games like Call of Duty or the Grand Theft Auto franchise. And yet, those games don't change at all. At all. And, there's a NC-17 or there's the 17 above sticker on those games. Yeah, whatever. Those get ignored. Go to a GameStop, stand there and watch parents bring in their little kids to buy them violent video games all the time. Those things aren't changing the content of this aspect of popular culture. But this did with comic books in here. And here's why. Because comic book publishers were getting pressure that was genuinely threatening their profits. Okay? All the people complaining about Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto with video games, those people aren't buying the video games themselves. And so the publishers of those video games just don't care. They don't care because it doesn't affect their profits. Your grandmother complaining about Call of Duty doesn't matter to them because your grandmother doesn't play Call of Duty. By the way, maybe your grandmother does play Call of Duty. I'm talking about a hypothetical grandmother. But comic book publishers were running into problems that were going to threaten their profits. Retail stores were increasingly threatening to not sell comic books. We're not going to sell them because we're getting too many complaints. Think of a store that comic books make up 0.002% of the store's profit. It's just a tiny fraction of their sales. And yet they have a Catholic Church organization picketing in front of their store because they're selling comic books. Stuff like that was happening. The easy solution for that store was, we're just not going to sell these comic books. All right? Printers were getting pressure from and starting to refuse to print up comic books. Distributors. There were companies that their job was to pick up material from publishers, books, magazines, comic books, and distribute them all around the United States and put them actually into stores. Distributors were starting to say, hey, we're getting threats from people that are going to boycott and picket us. We can't distribute your comic books. So the industry, unlike most other examples of criticism in the history of American popular culture that didn't really affect profits, comic book publishers really worried that this was going to affect their if they can't get their comic books printed, if they can't get their comic books distributed, and they can't get their comic books into retail stores, how are they going to make any money? So creating the Comic Book Code Authority to review these comic books. And what comes creating a list of rules, a set of standards, what comes to be known as the comic book code, or it just becomes known as the code, gets established to create a basis, a standard. So there couldn't be too much violence. That was part of the comic book code. Public authorities like courts, judges, police, politicians could not be shown in a negative light for fear it was going to create distrust in public institutions. Sex could not be shown in comic books. Women could not be shown in overly revealing clothing or sexually provocative situations. There was a list of things involved with this code, mostly tapping down sex, violence, and attempts at showing American institutions in a negative light. By the way, going back to our discussion before about the Cold War, that was also part of this context. There was some concern in the foreign policy world that the negative depiction of American society reflected in comic books was a useful tool of the communists to demonstrate to developing countries, you don't want to be like America. Look at their comic books. Look at what they themselves depict their society like. It's a nightmare. All right. So even within the context of the Cold War, there was criticisms leveled against comic books. And so this institution of the comic book code, and most of the comic book publishers went along with submitting their comic books, not all of them, but most of them, to submitting their comic books to the Comic Code Authority to have their comic books reviewed, went along with it because they were fearful that they wouldn't be able to stay in business if they didn't. The comic book code really transformed the comic book industry. Okay, comic book collectors, comic book historians talk about pre-code and post-code. The comic book industry was dramatically different after 1954 than it had been before 1954. We don't see that in a lot of areas. It's fascinating in American popular culture. Look, in the 1980s, when they put those stickers on albums, that didn't change the content of the music at all. The big areas of concern musically in the 80s for critics of music was heavy metal and rap music, hip hop, the burgeoning, hip hop was growing then. You could put a sticker on those albums, but it didn't change the kind of albums that were being made at all. You could put age stickers onto video games, particularly violent video games. It hasn't changed the content of video games at all. But the comic book code really did transform the industry. There was a marked decrease in violence, a marked decrease in overt sexuality. And certain comic book genres just went away. Like true crime comic books went away. I mean, the whole point of true crime comic books was startling and shocking imagery and storytelling from comics, and you just could no longer sell. Or you could sell it. You could publish it. You could print them up in a small run if you could find a printer that would do it. But stores without the comic book code sticker on it were just more resistant to selling these comic books. It was just harder to do. So this year of 1954 was a really sharp demarcation in terms of the content of comic books. It really changed and transformed the industry. Comic books were quite different after. I have it here, so I should explain it. One of the biggest critics of comic books, in fact, the biggest organized critic of comic books was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was really hell-bent, or maybe I should say heaven-bent, on trying to get rid of comic books. And so when it came to the creation of the Comics Magazine Association of America, the comic book publishers selected a former New York City judge, a man by the name of Charles Murphy. Charles Murphy was Catholic. Charles Murphy is a good Irish-sounding name. The Irish are very much associated with the Catholic Church. And so putting a guy by the name of Charles Murphy at the head of the magazine was an attempt to appease the American Catholic Church. And we hear you. We've put a Catholic at the head of this organization. We're paying attention to your needs. All right. Really transformed the nature of the industry. Later lecture, we'll talk about the decline of the code, although it doesn't go away. Into the 21st century, the comic book code still existed, although it evolved and changed over time. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. All right, that's enough for this lecture, everybody. All right, talk to you next time. Bye.